So the topic today is Theologians for Darwin. Specifically, the reason why I thought to bring this topic up is because Desmond Ford was here a couple of weekends ago, and I thought that someone needed to respond at least to some of what he said. It's impossible to respond to his positions on this topic completely in half an hour or not. But I thought I'd at least respond to one of the issues that we brought up, and hopefully it'll be interesting to you. It's very interesting to me. All right. Theologians for Darwin. I'll just start out with a quotes, just to give a basis for what the rest of the discussion will be about. The Church of England, I don't know if you know, but recently they announced on their public website that they're apologizing to Darwin. The Church of England owes you, Darwin, an apology for misunderstanding you and by getting our first reaction wrong, encouraging others to misunderstand you still. There's nothing here that contradicts Christian teaching and the theory of evolution. The Church's reaction now seems misjudged. This was particularly from Reverend Brown. He wrote this on the website September 17th, just this month. And so here we have the Church of England apologizing. We also have the Vatican holding a similar view. They responded to the apology of the Church of England, basically saying Darwin's theories are compatible with the Bible and never were condemned by the Catholic Church, nor was his book ever banned, which is pretty good for the Catholic Church. Desmond Ford, of particular relevance to the Adventist Church, because he was very prominent, or he still is very prominent in the Adventist circle. He writes, most educated people in Western countries regard Adventism as a 19th century cult. Now, why is that? Because, according to Desmond Ford, of the promoting of Ussher's 6,000-year-old chronology for its history of most of our existence, and because we ignore the evidence furnished by the geologic column, astronomy, continental drift, plate tectonics, radiometric dating, radiocarbon dating, amino acid dating, etc. I mean, it looks like we're overwhelmed here, and we're still hanging on to Ussher's 6,000-year chronology. What's wrong with it? Among Bible scholars who do accept the Scriptures as God's supernaturally inspired word, we are also considered an anachronism because of the way we interpret the early chapters of Genesis. Please know well that the issue here that is at stake is not the inspiration of Genesis, because Ford does believe that Genesis was inspired, but its interpretation. So, which interpretation is the most inspired, basically, is the issue. Ford goes on. Fundamentalists, like me, to be honest, hold that the literal meaning of the words is to be cherished and taught. There are practically no theologians of worldwide repute in this category. So I'm pretty much by myself. Another group looks at Genesis 1 as literature, semi-poetic in style, using the language of appearance so as to cater for all peoples of all ages and all places, despite illiteracy. The vast majority of scholarly commentaries in the last century take this position. So it's the majority. It's an argument from authority, is what Ford is presenting from here. Everybody believes this, so what's wrong with the minority? Ford also notes the work of Ron Numbers, where Ron writes, when Adventist scientists were polled in 1994, more than half rejected the literal reading of Genesis 1. 1/3 denied the geologic strata and its fossils can be explained by Noah's flood, and almost 1 in 5, 20%, assented to theistic evolution. That's within our Adventist Church, and that's in 1994. And I'm sure it's gotten worse since then, or better, whatever your perspective is. In wandering around the highways and byways of recent theology, Ford says, I have not encountered one example of a serious, sustained theological argument confirmed by the creation of the world in 6 literal days a few thousand years ago. From Adventists came Ellen White, that great evangelical Christian, but she wrote in the 19th century, and so she used Ussher's chronology. And George McCready Price, a brave, generous, intelligent man, trusted Ellen White so much that he perverted his science unknowingly. And that's where our creation research movement comes from. And it was spawned by George McCready Price, but it's gone. Even the Adventists have thrown out that old approach. Well, at least not the GC yet. Ford continues, never does the New Testament use the Old Testament for scientific purposes. Wherever time and eternity meet, metaphor must be used at both ends of the Bible, Revelation and Genesis, evidently. The Bible never reveals supernaturally anything humans can themselves discover. Just so Christ, the living Word, spoke only of the way of salvation. If Genesis were intended as science, it would consist purely of equations, written for oral use among children of earth who would be illiterate throughout most of the coming millenniums. The inspired Word speaks in a manner that all would be able to understand. As Christ took human symbols, Aramaic words, to express heavenly truths, so Moses, under inspiration, used contemporary idioms to tell who created the universe, not how or when. Discussion. I need to ask you a few questions, and I'll give you my answers, unlike some people who won't present their opinion, but I'll present mine, and you can think about yours and then ask me, or we'll discuss it at the end of the lecture. I'll hopefully have some time for that. First question, is the majority usually right? Well, it depends. Sometimes they are. And quite often they are. I mean, what is our government based on? Democratic rule, and why does everybody take a vote and the majority wins? Quite often that way of thinking has some sense. The majority, generally speaking, has at least some validity. So we can't just completely discount the majority view just because it's the majority. There's some reason why the majority is used as a claim to authority. It's because it often works. Should the majority scientific opinion be carefully considered? It should be. Here are a bunch of intelligent people. They've all agreed that this makes the most sense. Should that idea at least be carefully considered? Yeah, it only makes sense to consider the ideas of brilliant men carefully, and women. All right? Should the majority of opinion be accepted without question, however? Has the majority opinion, even in scientific communities, among the most brilliant men and women of science ever, has that ever been proved wrong? Have they ever come up with something that later on, we made a mistake? Yeah, so sometimes it's wrong. Do arguments that are based just on authority have explanatory power? Like when I was little, I remember going and asking my mom, "Hey Mom, why is this? Why did you tell me this? Why do I have to do that?" And she often said, especially for me, because I was very irritated, she often said, "Because I told you so." Now, sometimes that's good for me just to go ahead and obey her because she's an authority figure and she's usually right. But does that help me understand? Just that argument alone, just because I told you so. That doesn't really have explanatory power. It might be helpful to go ahead and do it, but as far as understanding, that's not really helpful. Now, as far as the author's intent, Desmond Ford indicated that Genesis is symbolic. Right? It should be interpreted symbolically as well as Revelation. But what was the author's intent who wrote Genesis? Was he intending to be symbolic, or was he intending to be taken very literal? So, Professor James Barr, religious professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford, he writes, "Probably, so far as I know, there is no professor in Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that A, creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. B, the figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provide by simple addition a chronology from the beginning of the world up to the latter stages of the biblical story. And C, Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and extinguish all human life and animal life except for those on the ark. Or to put it negatively, the apologetic arguments which suppose the days of creation to be long eras of time, the figures of years not to be chronological, and the flood to be merely local Mesopotamian flood, are not taken seriously by any such professors as far as I know." In other words, these guys say the author obviously intended to be taken literally. We just don't believe the author was right. This Professor James Barr, he doesn't believe in six literal days of creation, or in recent creation, or the worldwide nature of Noah's flood. He doesn't believe any of that. He just thinks the author got it wrong, which is much different than to say the author didn't get it wrong. He was trying to speak figuratively. That's not the case. He's just saying, right or wrong, the author was trying to say something literal in Genesis. So, also, what was the understanding of the Jewish readers? When the Jews throughout history, you had Genesis until past the time of Christ. Did they understand Genesis to be literal or figurative in their own understanding? I mean, who else would be better ask that question? Obviously, the Jews understand it to be very literal. They all interpret it in a literal manner, and so did Christ. Jesus himself referred to creation week and to the universal nature of Noah's flood as real historical events. And if Jesus didn't really understand because of the influence of his day, the thoughts of his day, then how can we accept other statements where Christ talks about the history not mentioned in the Bible that he says he personally experienced and saw? Like he said, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. How are you supposed to believe that if you can't even get the creation week right and Noah's flood right? He also claimed to personally know Abraham. How can you accept those statements if you can't even get the other stuff right based on the influence of his day? So you either have to say Christ didn't know what he was talking about or he did. There's no middle ground. Just understanding Genesis. Yeah, is that right? Right. The historical understanding. What was the original scholarly interpretation of Genesis as far as theologians and scientists are concerned? How did they interpret Genesis until the time of Darwin? All scientists and theologians of any significance, predominantly at least, interpreted Genesis very literally. In fact, they thought that in the studying of nature and natural law, they were trying to reveal the mind of God himself. It wasn't until after Darwin came along and Darwin's theories became popular that this whole idea that Genesis should be interpreted non-literally or metaphysically came into being. Before that time, even scientists thought that Genesis should be interpreted literally. That's how it reads. So when Darwin comes along, or any theory comes along that challenges your perception of reality, then it's only natural to not completely discard your theory, because you put a lot of investment in time, especially religious theologians. They put a lot of investment in time into their religious views on Genesis and human origins and whatnot. So they certainly don't want to get rid of it. But in a sense, though, if things keep falsifying what you used to believe, and you keep changing your little theory so that it doesn't completely collapse, it's called a post hoc modification. And if you do that continually, it means that your position is not falsifiable. You can't be wrong. You just change it so you're never wrong. You can't be disproved. So how useful is a non-falsifiable statement concerning the reality of the universe that exists outside the mind? For example, how is the statement that God exists by itself any different from the statement that the flying spaghetti monster exists? This argument is used all the time by the likes of Richard Dawkins. And to be honest, I can't see why he's wrong in that argument. Just the simple statement alone, God exists, is not intuitive. The same as the flying spaghetti monster exists. I mean, what evidence do you have to support that statement? There has to be something, or else these two statements are equivalent, and Dawkins is right. If the Bible claims concerning physical reality, even the intent to be taken literally and read literally for thousands of years, cannot be trusted, where is the usefulness of the metaphysical claims of the Bible? How can you trust the Bible on one hand and know that the Bible is completely wrong on the other? The other argues that the Bible never reveals anything that humans can themselves discover. Now, come on, is that really true? What about the virgin birth? Can we discover that just by researching it? What about the resurrection of the dead, or the second coming of Christ, eternal life, heaven and the New Jerusalem? Is it possible just by studying and researching that we can figure that out? Or do we just have to take somebody's word for it? And on what basis do we take their word for it? Are these biblical claims to the promised physical reality discoverable outside of divine aid? Ford also argues that the Bible is not at all involved with any kind of real science, but is rather concerned exclusively with other transcendent truths that go beyond the powers of scientific investigation. The Bible really is not a scientific text at all in any sense of the word. So, my question is, what's the basis for believing the Bible as true versus any other good book or idea, like the Book of Mormon, the Quran, or any other belief system? What basis is there for us being in the Adventist Church? Is it just because we were born in it? because our parents were there? Or do we have any logical reason for us still being here? Ford's evidence for biblical inspiration. Ford does need evidence. He believes the Genesis is inspired by God. And so what does he use as evidence of the divine? He, surprising to me, actually uses numerology. Very unusual statistical evidences for the divine. He writes, but can we really be certain that Genesis narrative is inspired? Certainly, there exists in Scripture, particularly in its introductory passages, what has been called the seal of seven. The first sentence of the Bible has 7 Hebrew words and 4 times 7 Hebrew letters, or 28 letters. The 3 nouns, God, heaven, and earth, have the number value of 777. Each Hebrew letter stands for a number. See any Hebrew grammar. There is one Hebrew verb, created, and its numerical value is 2 or 3, or 7 times 29. According to some researchers, there are at least 30 different numerical features in this verse. Statistically, the chance of this happening is 1 in 30 trillion. I have checked it out. 1 dozen of these from my own Hebrew Bible, and they're all true according to him. But he doesn't endorse the extreme views of Ivan Panin. So who is Ivan Panin? This whole secret Bible code approach is very interesting. It kind of started off with Ivan Panin. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1882 from Russia. In 1890, he claimed to have made a startling biblical discovery. It was not about hidden Bible messages, rather it was about numerical patterns that he said permeated all the inspired Scripture, but no other literature. Panin publicized his discoveries in the New York Sun in a letter to the editor entitled "The Inspiration of Scriptures is Scientifically Demonstrated." Like Ford, Panin also used the opening words of Scripture as one of his prime examples. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In Hebrew, this verse does contain 7 words, feature 1, which have 14, or 7 times 2 syllables, feature 2, and 28, 7 times 4 letters, feature 3. Words containing the subject and predicate have 14 letters, and words containing the object, 14 letters, feature 4. This example is said to be even more extensive because Panin persists in examining it until he has discovered 25 features, all adding up to 7, or some multiple of 7, some rather exotic, involving 7 or multiple of 7. To Panin, this outcome was absolute proof that the verse was inspired. And hey, who can argue with that? That's impressive. 1 in a trillion, or 30 trillion. Well, let's look at a few actual statistics here. Note that the success in searching for some kind of pattern of 7, i.e. 7 or multiples of 7 like 14, 21, 28, in any random sequence should be achieved after 1 in 7 searches on average. So statistically, to find 25 successful matches to the 7 pattern, one needs only to examine a total of 175 features, since by chance 1 in 7 would succeed. So saying, I found 25 features that add up to 7, that's really not that impressive. The object of success, therefore, is not 1 in 7 to the 25th, as Ford suggests, but are in fact essentially 100%, given a fairly short search through a different number of patterns looking for the match to the multiple of 7. Ford has fallen for a classic statistical trick. This is not evidence of the divine. Exactly the same problem exists for all the other versions of the hidden Bible codes, some of which foretell everything from Hitler to 9/11 to George W. Bush scratching his nose. Michael Drosden and a bunch of other guys, Drosden and his famous Bible Code 1 and 2. John Nash, everybody seen the movie The Beautiful Mind?
Yeah.
He saw patterns in everything. Newspapers, license plates, all kinds of stuff that he thought was, Russian, right, trying to invade the U.S. or something like that. Such hidden codes are by no means unique to the Bible, but can be found in any work from Shakespeare to Dr. Seuss. Using the Hebrew translation of War and Peace, for example, a researcher by the name of McKay and his team achieved a significance level of 1 in a million in their search for predetermined word associations, the same level of significance that Drosden used in his Bible codes. Using a tuning technique used by Bible coders, Australian television personality John Safarin and McKay demonstrated that this tuning technique by showing evidence of 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York in the lyrics of Vanilla Ice repertoire, the rapper. Yeah, a rapper, man, he must be inspired. The coded predictions are also not often figured out ahead of time for some strange reason. They're usually post-predictions. They're not very good at predicting the future when it comes actually to predicting the future. There was actually one famous example where truly Drosin did predict the future. He said that Rabin was going to be assassinated. And he said that in 2002 and 2004. Not in 2002. He said that in 94 and then in 96, I think it was. He was assassinated 2 years later after the prediction. So then he said, aha, my Bible code is actually helpful in predicting the future. Of course, then he went on to say that there would be a nuclear holocaust in 2006, and we're not holocausted yet. And we're past 2006, and so now he's no longer making such predictions. Instead, he says that his Bible codes suggest what might happen in the future given our current course of action if we don't change. But he's no longer making predictions. According to game theory, ironically proposed by John Nash, beautiful mind, background noise or random sequences can appear to be meaningful or ordered in sections like patterns of stars, all the constellations. We put patterns on them. Clouds, we make clouds look like elephants and whatever. Tree bark, burnt toast. Did you see eBay? They sold a burnt toast for like $30,000 at the Virgin Mary. Fuzzy carpet. If you stare at your carpet long enough, you're going to see faces and whatever you want to see in it. It's not at all unusual statistically if the goal or some pattern in mind is already in mind ahead of time to see that pattern in a random sequence. You can look long enough, you'll see it. The same sort of tuning also occurs, interestingly enough, I won't get into this right now, in radiometric dating, true ring dating, and other pattern-based calibration techniques where the desired or suspected pattern is known ahead of time. Is it really better to maintain the divine origin of Genesis on such subjective numerology versus accepting that it has been actually falsified based on the clear reading of the actual non-coded text, and therefore accept that it is without significant evidence of the need for the miraculous? Why not just say, look, Genesis is wrong as far as what we can falsify, and therefore it has no really solid evidence of being inspired? Isn't that much more honest than saying, oh, let's look for some weird hidden code that still makes it inspired? Fourth, another proof of the divinity of Genesis. In Genesis, Abraham is predicted to be the spiritual father of nations and people like the stars in the sky. That prediction has shown itself to be quite accurate. It's undeniable. Abraham is the acknowledged patriarch of the three world major religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Therefore, Genesis must be divinely inspired, right? Because how is that prediction? It came true. It's undeniable. But what about other predictions of famous leaders and religious founders like Muhammad and Joseph Smith? The success of their religion, of Mormonism or Islam, isn't that proof that they were also divinely inspired? So you have to be careful about what you use as evidence for divine inspiration. There is, on the other hand, the problem of getting it wrong. In Deuteronomy, it says, if what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord, and that's important, a prophet can be wrong all the time, but if the prophet says this is what the Lord says, and it doesn't take place or come true, that message that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. So it's very important that if a prophet claims that the Lord has spoken to him, that he get it right. Okay? So while the fulfillment of certain types of prophecies are not necessarily solid evidence of divine inspiration, the lack of fulfillment of a claim of a prophet said to be from God is evidence that he or she is not from God. This prophet does not speak for God and is not to be trusted. So the positive on one hand is not the same as the negative on the other. So what about Jonah? Jonah prophesied that Nineveh would be destroyed in 40, 30, 20 days, so on. And it wasn't. So does that make Jonah a false prophet as he feared himself? Look, God, if you don't wipe them out, they'll all think I'm a false prophet. Right? What's interesting about prophecies like that is that by implication, God sent Jonah to tell Nineveh you're going to be destroyed. By implication that he gave Nineveh time in the prophecy means that there's hope for Nineveh. Why would God give Nineveh time if they really, to make them wish worry about it? and then wipe them out anyway, regardless of what they did. It's by implication that they have hope. That say, hey, wait, we have 40 days. Why would God give us 40 days unless there's some hope for us? And so by implication of that prophecy, if you change from doing what you're doing, X won't happen. If you don't change, by implication of the prophecy, X will happen. You will be destroyed. So people using Jonah to counteract, prophecies not being fulfilled doesn't exactly make sense to me because of the implication of the prophecy itself. This is a conditional prophecy, obviously. There's other prophecies that are not conditional, like I will come again. There's no condition on that. He will come again. That's not a conditional prophecy. At least believe the miracles. Miracles used as evidence. They are used as evidence throughout the Bible. John especially uses miracles as what he calls signs. Signs of the divine. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Or at least believe the evidence of the miracles. If you don't believe my own testimony, Christ says to his listeners, at least believe what I did as a miraculous sign. If you don't come take my word for it, how do you explain what the miracles I'm doing? Can anybody else do that except for God? Jesus also has another quote. I did tell you, but you did not believe. The miracles I do in my Father's name speak for me. So what basis do you have not to believe what I just told you? It's kind of like playing pool or golf. If somebody gets a great shot in golf, you can say, oh, yeah, lucky, right? Yeah. Tiger Woods is famous for saying, do it again. Oh, good shot, do it again. So at what point, though, if someone does it again and again and again, do you still say, oh, you got lucky again? Right? At some point, you have to say, maybe he's good. So, the science of miracles. This is a famous cartoon. Showed all the time to laugh at the concept of miracles in science. Because here's a formula, they go along. Oh, here's a miracle. We can't explain this part. And then the rest of the formula goes on. Right? So, does that make any sense? Is there actually ever a point in science where scientists would reasonably say, we have to invoke a miracle? All right. I think yes, and I'll explain why I think so. In my notes, I can't do my different display, so I'll have to remember what I said to myself in my notes. But, for example, let's say that you're baking cake. Science can put formulas for all the chemical interactions of mixing all the ingredients together and what happens when you put it in the oven and you heat it up and everything. And you explain all the interactions and why things merge and change into different formulas and different chemicals. Science can do all that with formulas. Can science explain, though, why the cake came out as a cake? With just formulas? Anybody? No, right? Science cannot explain why the cake came out of a cake just using formulas. Science has to invoke intelligent design to explain that cake. Without the input of a miracle of intelligent design, no chemical reaction formulas can explain a cake getting all mixed up properly and coming out as a recognizable cake. And so, in that sense, science does have to invoke a miracle to explain some things. The same with SETI scientists. The SETI scientists are looking for certain types of radio signals coming from outer space. And to them, if they find a certain type of radio signal, a certain unique type of radio signal with a mathematical pattern or whatever, they're going to say, this is beyond the powers of any natural process that we can put formulas to. They basically say, we cannot explain that type of radio signal without invoking the miracle of intelligent design. Does that make sense? Scientists actually do this. The only thing that scientists have problems with is where you say this miracle is performed by God. Scientists actually don't have a problem invoking miracles at all. They do so all the time. Forensic science, anthropology, all these things are based on the detection of the miracle of intelligent design, which cannot be explained by scientific formulas at all. So they have no problem using miracles in the formulas. They only have a problem when they say the miracle was done by God. The science of miracles. John in particular explains the purposes of God's use of miracles as signs or evidence of divinity. In this sense, miracles are used by John to support his story as being literal or real in what could be called a scientific manner, the same thing as SETI scientists do. Even Ford recognizes the need for the miraculous as convincing evidence of divine inspiration. That's why he tries to resort to numerology. I mean, because what else do you have to support your hypothesis that Genesis is actually inspired by Ford claims? But what is a clear miracle? Can the concept really be defined to the general agreement of all or even most of us? To me, miracles are relative, like relativity. One thing's relative to another. They are relative in that they must clearly be beyond the powers of the force in question, but must be within the powers of higher level forces. Emphasis on the word clearly, obviously. Some things are kind of vague. For example, if an engineer made a highly symmetrical polished granite cube, would that be miraculous? From the perspective of that engineer, no, right? Not miraculous, because obviously we know that engineers can do that. However, if I told you that a tornado did it, would that be miraculous? Yes, right? Because from the perspective of a tornado or a weather pattern, a highly symmetrical polished granite cube doesn't happen, right? So that's a miracle using that explanation, right? Here's some crop circles from England. When these crop circles first came out, there were some scientists that actually proposed unusual weather patterns as explanations. Would that be a miracle for a tornado to make something like that? Or anything like that? However, later on, I don't know if you can see this, but see these little track waves? If you go up in an airplane and look down at these, you can kind of see these track waves. And they found out later when they did a hidden camera of these things, of fields in England, they finally found these two guys. They went in there with ropes and a board, and they went and stopped down the rain in these patterns. And they did geometric designs and whatnot, and they caught them. So, here's a French garden. Is that a miracle of nature? Not a miracle of nature. It's a miracle of intelligent design, right? Obviously. What about this? This is a little more tricky. Would anybody say, here's a river rock, all the granite stones. Is that design? Here? Obviously design.
You couldn't say for sure.
You messed up my whole... Let me just tell you, all of these definitely were designed. These are fake river rocks from a site that makes river rocks to look like river rocks for your garden and whatnot. So all of these were designed, but you can't tell for sure that that one was designed because that looks like a river rock. But this one you can tell, right? And that one too, maybe, possibly that one. Here's it's kind of getting on the verge. Can't exactly tell because it's, that could have been produced somewhere by nature. And maybe those ones are more clearly designed. But you get the point. How about this one? Was this designed or not? It was designed, right? 19 the natural garden. So they deliberately planted it to look like a natural garden. So you can't really tell if there's something is or isn't designed on some cases, but in other cases you can definitely tell. Now were these designed? Deliberately designed, like God chiseled them out all individually? No, these have natural rules that can explain them when they interact with natural forces of nature. Snowflakes just self-assemble themselves all by themselves. No need to have someone chisel it out. Same for pyrite and whatnot, salt crystals. They all have the same geometric shape, but because of the material that is used, we do not need to invoke, or we are not forced to invoke intelligent design as we are for a granite cube that has the same essential shape. Because granite does not self-assemble itself into cube, and neither do crop circles. However, other materials do automatically self-assemble themselves into these shapes. Here's more pictures of interesting snowflakes, which just self-assemble themselves amazingly. How about this, though? Would you believe it if I told you a hurricane picked up all these trees and shoved them into the beach like this? No, you wouldn't believe that? It could happen, given a long enough time. What about the Stonehenge? Given millions and millions of years, it's bound that somewhere on this planet, something like this is bound to show up, right? On what basis do you say that? What about being tricked? Is it possible that what looks like a miracle or what looks like intelligent design is nothing more than a cleverly designed magic trick or an unusual quirk of nature? Is that possible? It's possible. Is it likely all the time? Not necessarily likely, like for Stonehenge. Stonehenge, possible, highly unlikely. Okay? In other words, you could always be wrong. Ardent scientists, however, rightly wary of charlatans and tricksters that have often been used these tricks to deceive the gullible throughout history. I mean, scientists are perfectly within their right to be skeptical of a lot of these things that come along for the first time, right? Because tricks are common. You have to be mathematical, statistical publications have to be carefully analyzed to make sure they are not really deceptive. In other words, for example, was Pharaoh, do you really give him such a bad rap? Was he really that off base when he questioned the miracles produced by Moses at first? Someone comes along, they drop their staff on the ground and it turns into a snake. And then you call your musicians, hey guys, can you do that? And, oh yeah, no problem, it's just a trick. And so they throw their rods down and they turn into snakes. And then what's Pharaoh supposed to think? Yeah, of course, Moses' snake came and ate up all the rest of the snakes. But come on. I mean, ultimately speaking, Pharaoh is bound to be at least a little bit logical in saying, I still have a few questions about this trickery stuff. You know, isn't that reasonable? I think it is. However, where do you draw the line on hard-headedness? That's like Moses hit the first, two-shot par 5 on golf. Well, that's pretty good, but I'm not convinced. Is that reasonable? Right? But let's say Moses does it another 10 times in a row. Now, are you still reasonable to be just as skeptical as you were at first? At some point, you have to draw the line and say, okay, you're probably pretty good at this. The biblical authors claim that God desires thoughtful, intelligent investigation and testing of the miraculous. The Bible, or God, doesn't expect us just to believe without any sort of investigation or insight. The Bible specifically tells us that we need to reason together, use our brains. It also tells God himself, tells us to test him and see if he will not open the floodgates of heaven and pour us out a blessing that we can't explain by natural cause. He also tells us to test the spirits and actually see if they're from God by some process of scientific investigation. However, again, like I said, at some point there comes a time when you have to take a leap of faith where you can't absolutely be certain. The same thing is true of scientists. Nothing in science is absolute. Scientists only establishes predictive value that gets greater and greater the more times your hypothesis is verified or that your predictions come true. But the predictions never establish perfect predictive value. There's always a little bit of faith there, a little bit of the unknowable. Because if you could perfectly know something, would you need science? No. If you internally knew something, you wouldn't need science because science only explains what is inherently not perfectly knowable. For example, do I need science to know that my wife, Sigrid, that I love my wife, Sigrid? Do I need science for that? Or what about the fact that I like vanilla ice cream? Do I need science for that? Do I have to test it after I've already experienced vanilla ice cream and I know that I like it? Or that I like Sigrid? Do I have to go in and continually investigate that, or do I just know it as an internally derived fact? We don't need science for that anymore. I don't need science for that. However, do I need science to establish that, in my mind, that my wife loves me? Is it possible that she could be tricking me all these years? Right? If she is, she's very good at it. Right? So, yeah, you do need science to predict or hypothesize about something outside of yourself and predict its future, about how it should act or will act. That's what science does. It's involved with predicting stuff. What about getting a good idea that God loves you? Does my faith increase or decrease with increasing evidence that God loves me or that my wife loves me? Does my faith in Sigrid and her love for me increase or decrease as she shows me more and more evidence of that faith? Right? Some people say that God doesn't give us evidence because he desires faith, and that the less evidence you have, the greater the faith. Is that true? Mm-hmm. Right? Does my faith increase or decrease when Sigrid shows me that she loves me more and more? My faith increases, right? Your faith and trust in God and your faith and trust in your loved ones actually increases with increasing evidence. It doesn't decrease. And God doesn't expect blind faith either. What about the science of the eyewitness? Biblical authors claim to be direct witnesses of miraculous events or visions of historical events given from God. However, as we all know, eyewitnesses are notoriously untrustworthy in courts of law, right? However, it depends on the eyewitness. Otherwise, we wouldn't use them at all in courts of law. If an eyewitness was completely untrustworthy and never depend on them, we wouldn't use them at all, right? So it depends on the reliability of the eyewitness. It also depends on the obviousness of the situation or circumstance. It's very hard to misinterpret some observations. Like, if I said, I saw that there were 3 evenings and mornings, even if I was completely dumb as a stump, it'd be very hard for me to get that wrong, right? I mean, it's very hard. I mean, you got light, then you got dark, and you got light, and dark. It's hard to misinterpret such an obvious observation, right? If you want to talk about subtleties, like, was there, did the guy who shot you have 5 or 4 fingers on his left hand? Well, that's easier to get wrong. You see what I'm saying? But if you say, was it a guy or a girl? That's a bit harder to get wrong. Well, maybe not these days. So
was the gun shot?
Yeah, was the gun shot? Something like that. Also, if you have 11 of your closest friends in the world, and they come to you and they say, we saw something, and they all agree with each other, even though you believe it to be impossible, is it at least reasonable to consider what they have to say? Right? They're your closest friends in the world. So even if you think it's impossible, shouldn't you at least look into it a little bit? Predictive power, however, works both ways. If the testimony of a witness is proven to be false in one area, what happens to the predictive power of the hypothesis of the testimony of the same witness, and that he will or she will prove true in another area of testimony? If you demonstrate that they're not reliable in something very obvious, like they can't even get evenings and mornings right, they can't get the gun was shot or wasn't shot, how reliable will you be able to be in them? How trustworthy, what kind of faith will you have in another area of testimony that you can't even validate or not, you can't even test? Likewise, there's a testimony of the claimed prophet or divine messenger proves to be false in the physical realm of testability, where we can actually evaluate. What are the odds that their metaphysical claims will actually be true? The claims that they make that we cannot evaluate. Examples: the virgin birth, the end of the second coming, resurrection, the accession. We can't actually evaluate that. So upon what basis do we believe somebody when they tell us that these things happen or will happen? Ford is trying to have his cake, in my opinion, and eat it too. Ford claims to believe that Ellen White and the authors of the Genesis account, authors that truly intended to be taken as describing real historical events given to them by God, were inspired by God. Ford believes that they were inspired by God, even though their testimony simply isn't valid regarding what we can actually evaluate historically. Again, what good is the metaphysical testimony of either biblical or extra-biblical prophets or messengers from God if their testimony regarding that which we can test and investigate is so far off? Why not simply admit that there is no evidence of the divine involvement and be honest about it, like Richard Dawkins, instead of coming up with fantastic numerology theories equivalent to the science of astrology? Richard Dawkins, in my view, is more logical given its initial premise. If the Bible and Ellen White are as clearly off base as Ford suggests regarding some of the clearest and most straightforward statements of simple physical realities, like, hey, it was created in 6 or 7 evenings and mornings, how are their metaphysical claims worth the paper they're written on? When it comes to a solid foundation, the kind of hope that casts out all fear, that you can really sink your teeth into, what do you have if you don't have something that you can actually evaluate? In this sense, the lives of Richard Dawkins seem far more logical compared to theologians like Desmond Ford or other greats from the Vatican or the Church of England. Religion is useless without a scientific element of falsifiability. Religion, if it is to be useful, should at least open the potential for falsification as any true science. If it isn't falsifiable, it's worthless, in my opinion. And if it has been falsified, as far as it is possible to test it, why all the effort to save something that is so obviously bankrupt with such desperate arguments as those presented by the likes of Ford and other theologians in this same case? Conclusion: the importance of a literal interpretation of Genesis to Christian and Messianic theology in particular. I mean, Ford asks, I've gone all over the world and I've talked to lots of theologians. I've never seen any argument to explain why the literal interpretation is theologically important. To me, is that without the literal read in fairly recent history and a global molecular flood, there is little left besides Ford's numerology to clearly set forth the hypothesis of the divine inspiration of Genesis. All that the believer really has left is blind faith. If you knock out that, as far as believing in Genesis, that is divine. And that's it. Open up for questions.
Observation, Jesus recognized his precise same problem when he had a man who was let down through the roof. And he said, your sins are forgiven you, and everybody's, a lot of people are saying, this is happening with your sins. And then Jesus says, which is easier? And theologians have struggled to try to make it harder to say your sins are forgiven. But Jesus is making a very, very intelligent point. Your sins are forgiven, you can't prove that. But you say, rise up and walk, and the guy doesn't walk, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, because if the guy did not get up and walk when Jesus said get up and walk, what happens to the sins?
Yeah.
They're still there, probably, right?
So showing the stones and, is this design, is that design? And then you come to this, like the snowflake system. And you say, is that design? No, that's not design. And I'm thinking, it's not design. Would not an ID person say that is a sign of the designer?
An intelligent design person, at least a theorist, especially the ones who don't believe in God, and there are others who don't believe in God, say that there are natural laws that explain the snowflake that we can't understand, that don't require human-level intelligent input or any higher-level intelligent input. They basically are explainable by the information content within the water molecules themselves.
So you're saying, then what's designed is human. You're testing human design.
But from an intelligent design perspective, as far as the theory of intelligent design, that's correct. And the same thing is true for religion. We cannot actually fully discover the full design potential or understand God completely. It's impossible. All we can basically understand is that God is bigger and better than us. We compare him with ourselves and we say, compared to me, God is pretty darn good, as far as creativity and the rest of it, itself, infinite nature. We can't actually wrap our minds around the infinite, is what I'm trying to say. We can't understand the infinite. So what we can understand is that whatever he is, he's most likely infinite because he's much better than me.
There's a point.
Yes.
Where did the laws come from?
Yeah, that's a different issue. If you want to go ultimately, who made all the laws? That's a different issue. I'm going to give them all the laws. Give the opposition all the laws that they want, and say, all right, from this point on, is it intelligent design or not? The same with the cake. Given all the laws you want, can you explain the cake? No. You have to invoke intelligent design. Yes.
Well, let's come back to the snowflake for a bit, because that's actually a very important issue. The difference from the design perspective is snowflake and a living thing, for instance, can be defined in very objective scientific terms. I'm not a physicist, but apparently it can be understood why a snowflake is the way it is, because of the laws of nature. Living things depend on biological information. In DNA and proteins, we're like words on a page. And scientifically speaking, there are no laws that will put those things in the right order. It has to come from somewhere else. So there's a total difference. Just a comment on Ford, on the timing of all this. This isn't something new in his mind. When he was teaching at PUC, a nephew of mine was in one of these classes. And issue came up in class of the age of the earth and what Ellen White says. And Ford's response was, well, she didn't have any education. I have a friend with a PhD in geology. Who am I going to believe?
Right. Yeah, that's a complicated question. For a long time, the church supported the idea that everything in the universe was created at creation. Right? But if you actually read the first chapters or the first verses of Genesis, it says, in the beginning, God created everything. Period. Right? It doesn't say what the beginning was. Right? Then it says, and the earth was formless and without void, and the Spirit hovered over the surface of the deep. It seems to indicate that something was here at the beginning, already here at the beginning of creation. And that's what I personally believe. I believe that the material, the matter of the world, and also Job seems to indicate that there was something else in the universe before the creation week, because it says the sons of God sang together at the foundation of the earth. Right? So where did the sons of God live? Right? And so I believe certainly that the Bible supports, or at least indicates, the idea that there was pre-existent material, and there's probably pre-existent life, and the devil in the great controversy is said to get jealous over the creation of humans, right? So I believe that angels existed, other intelligences existed before our planet came into being. However, I don't believe that life on Earth is old, or that there's any evidence for good evidence for old life on Earth, to include carbon dating and other later dating methods, which are all based on dating the geologic column and the fossil record, which I believe is a product of catastrophe.
I always have to laugh because radiocarbon dating always gets in that list, and it's the worst case scenario that can make.
Right, because radiocarbon dating is actually quite limited to young things, less than 5,000, or actually less than 40 or 50,000 years old.
I think one mistake that Ford and others make is they confuse two different sort of components of what science does. The one component is things that you can study in your laboratory that are happening right now, you can study over and over again. On the other hand, things that happened thousands of years ago, we weren't there, and they think that science can have as much confidence in one as in the other.
Yeah, historical-based science, I mean, the science of history is the softest science there is. It's not like mathematics or statistics or anything that you can actually do in real time in your lab.
Or even nuclear physics.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the softest call there is in science. I mean, it's still a science. And you can investigate it and come up with good theories that have good predictive value. But it's much harder. Anthropology and coming up with how people live based on a tooth fragment is kind of, more, Carson putting up to his forehead, and saying, this is what happened. It's a pretty soft call as far as science is concerned. And to equate what happens in real time in the laboratory with the opinions of anthropologists about what happened 10 million years ago is not at all comparable.
I have the NID working policy, and it says that the teachers that teach different than the denomination should be dismissed.
I personally believe that, but I do think it would split the church. Because there's so many of our teachers and theologians who actually believe that.
I suppose one question would be, if we split the church, would that be beneficial or harmful? I'm not sure that would be harmful.
I'm not sure either.
One other comment, as far as these schools, the way the church structure is made, GC really there isn't much they could do about a teacher, let's say, Union College or La Sierra. It's the divisions that have more. And even there, you come down to, if a college manages to get its board set up just right, there's really nothing that anybody can do.
Except the GC could make it more public and put more pressure in a public manner, which they
It seems to me though that parents should be informed about what is going on.
at the very least. I gave a lecture at La Sierra where I was not allowed to actually come onto the campus of La Sierra to talk about creation perspective. So the student body, the association, rented out a hall close by for me to come in. And there's about 500 of them that came, and a lot of teachers and stuff that came. And what it all boiled down to is that at the very least, the parents weren't informed about what their children were being taught there. And they were definitely being taught evolution to the exclusion of any mention of creation in upper division science classes. It wasn't even allowed to be discussed. No guest speakers were allowed to come and address the students. I wasn't allowed to come because I didn't have a PhD in science. The particular topic at the time was ice-core dating. And since I didn't have a PhD in that, then I wasn't allowed to come and speak. However, for the evolution side of the equation, they brought a guy in to talk about ice-core dating that didn't have a PhD or even any degree, a science degree at all, to talk about ice-core dating from the evolutionary perspective. So it's kind of a double standard at La Sierra. And the parents were unaware, as far as the students I talked to. And at the very least, if someone is paying for the education of their child, they should at least know what they're paying for.
What was the impetus for the cause for the Church of England to come up with that statement? I heard that. I had read that, but I wasn't sure why they came up at this point in time. Why now at this point in time did they feel it they need to do that?
I think they felt kind of pressure from being left behind because the Vatican had already made a statement on that Darwin was correct and that he wasn't at odds with Christianity. And so the Anglican Church, I think, felt kind of left out. They said, okay, we think the same thing too. We're all part of it.
We can expect a lot of that Darwin's birthday.
Yeah, that's true. It's coming up to 200 year.
February 12th.
Yeah, so he'll already be part of it.
Why he's allowed to come to one of the conference churches, Desmond Ford?
He was invited by Adventist Today, which to me is a very liberal journal, but it shouldn't have the term Adventist on it because it really doesn't promote what the GC's version of Adventism is. And it depends on, I guess, how you define Adventism. But he was promoted or sponsored by Adventist Today, and that's how he came here. And as far as
but the church doesn't have any responsibility,
again, the GC doesn't control local churches. It's up to the local church pastorship and leadership as far as who you invite to take over their pulpit.
If you bring a bishop or a priest or any other denomination,
that's happened a lot here. Yeah.
Well, one thing, and to come back to the original, I found it fascinating that Desmond Ford uses the argument that we're the only denomination, the only major denomination that believes this. Well, I hope you would say major because I know there are some minor ones, smaller than us, that also believe it. But we're probably the largest major denomination, or the largest denomination in the world that believes in the six-day creation, the worldwide flood, a few thousand years ago. But the thing that I find fascinating is that we also are the largest major denomination of Christianity that believes in keeping the Sabbath. And it's curious to me that Desmond Ford doesn't want to give up on the Sabbath, even though that's definitely minority view also, and then uses the argument that we're out of sync with everybody else. He said that we should give up on creation.
He's a bit schizophrenic in what he supports and doesn't support on whatever basis.
I know a number of prominent creationists who are not Southern Baptists and various others. They respect our church because like some of my friends have said, you're the only denomination that's staying with the literal creation. They're disgusted with what's happening in their own church. We shouldn't let them down.
Yeah, I mean, to me, even if it's a small little crowd, what happened when Elijah complained to God, I'm the only one left? And God says, oh, by the way, I have 7 other guys, or 7,000 other guys who haven't abandoned me either. And it doesn't really matter if you feel like you're the one. It matters what you think the truth is, based on your ability to look into it and reason it out. And I think that's the only thing that God expects of us, even if we're wrong. That God expects us just to be honest with what we believe is true. And that's, like, for example, sometimes people in the Bible have gotten things very wrong, and God has said that's okay. Like, for example, Pharaoh took Abraham's wife, Sarah, to be in this forum, and God struck his whole family with sterility, right? And then God came to Pharaoh in a dream and says, I'm God. Your life is in my head, and you're a dead man. And Pharaoh's like, what? I had no idea. I'm innocent. And God says, I know you're innocent. That's why I didn't kill you already. Right? And so the claim of innocence that I didn't know is a valid claim before God. And so just because you got something wrong, that's okay with God, but you still are called to live up to what you think is right. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I enjoyed being here.